Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm very excited to welcome Forrest Hartman back to the podcast today to talk about Silent Running, starring Bruce Dern, released 50 years ago in March of 1972. How are we doing, Forrest?
I'm doing great. It's always great to be on your podcast, Brian. As we've said in past shows, it's really fun to record with somebody I've known so long, who I know is just as passionate about film as I am. So
Yeah.
thanks for having me on.
More than 20 years now we've known each other, and you've been one of my most regular guests here. This is our 5th or 6th episode. Really great to have you back.
Yeah, excellent, and excited to talk about this film.
Silent Running, our first episode, my first episode with you, talking about a 1972 film. This came out in a really crazy time of the year. When we think of like the big movies of any given year, right? We usually think of like the summer or the fall, but like I would say the biggest movies of 72 came out in the early part of the year. In the course of a month and a half, we got Cabaret, Silent Running, What's Up, Doc, and The Godfather before we even got to April. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, film distribution, I would argue, in this era was a little bit, well, a lot different than it is, particularly now. I was going to say a little different than now, a lot different than now, because now we got the streaming platforms and everything. But really, the whole blockbuster thing started coming along a little bit late and later in the 70s. I mean, a lot of people point to like Jaws and Star Wars. I mean, that sort of started this whole cycle of blockbuster season. So maybe that played into it, but you're right. Yeah, we would normally think of a film like this hitting in the summer or just December, something like that.
Yeah, today Silent Running definitely would be a summer movie, and The Godfather probably would have gone straight to streaming.
Yeah.
Which is weird to think, but it's true, right?
Oh, probably. Yeah. So streaming is, I mean, that's gotten really interesting since the pandemic, right?
It's like The Irishman, right? Which went direct to Netflix. Like I feel like in 1971, 72, that The Irishman would have come out in theaters and been a big hit. But now it's on Netflix. Yeah, so things were very different back then than they are today. Let's talk about Silent Running, Forrest. Had you heard of this movie before? Had you seen this before?
I had heard of it, and this is one of the weird things. I'm getting so old, Brian. I'm 54. I'd certainly heard of it and was aware of it. And watching it, I don't know if you've ever had this feeling. I had like a weird sense of deja vu, where
yeah, that happens to me sometimes.
I didn't before watching it remember having seen it, but while watching it, it was like, I think I've seen this film before, but I can't recall when. And if I did, it was probably like 20 years ago. Have you ever experienced that?
Right. Oh, sometimes, and it happens to my dad all the time. He says he'll just pull up a movie on Netflix, he'll watch it. It'll take him like a half hour, and he'll go, I've seen this before. It's happened to me maybe 2 or 3 times in the last year, like where I put on an older movie that I thought I hadn't seen. I'm like, oh, I feel like it's happened at least once for the podcast. Silent Running, the problem with 70s science fiction movies, a lot of them kind of like blend together, right? Like, this is the period of THX 1138, and then Logan's Run is coming up, and some of these movies, Soylent Green, some of them kind of like, they exist as one in my head. So it's like, have I not?
They are very similar, and with Silent Running, it may be one of those things too. I mean, this is a film that's obviously film at 50, been out long enough that it's been on TV. It may be a situation where I watched 30 minutes of it on TV 20 years ago or something like that, because there were scenes that felt very familiar to me, and then there were scenes that I didn't recall at all if I have seen it. So, but to answer your question, I was certainly aware of the film.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a name that gets bannered about in sci-fi circles and things like that. I did not recall having seen it, but I did have deja vu moments while watching it. So my best guess is I had probably seen at least portions of it at some point in the past, and not fully synthesized them.
Maybe you saw it in the theater when you were 4.
That That is knowing my mom and my father
It's rated G.
passed away. It's doubtful. My dad might have been into it. This is not really the sort of thing that my mom likes to this day.
Oh, okay.
So I doubt that.
So maybe they took you to The Godfather instead.
Probably.
All right. So for those of our listeners who might not know what this movie is all about, here's just a short synopsis of Silent Running. So after the end of all botanical life on Earth, ecologist Freeman, played by Bruce Dern, maintains a greenhouse on a space station in order to preserve various plants for future generations. Assisted by 3 robots and a small human crew, Lowell rebels when he is ordered to destroy the greenhouse in favor of carrying cargo, a decision that puts him at odds with everyone but his mechanical companions. Lowell and his robots are forced to do anything they can to keep their invaluable greenery alive. It's kind of the basic storyline of this movie. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that? I mean, no, it's very intimate, like the story. It's very much like a one-man show.
Yeah, not quite the same as like Castaway with Tom Hanks, but certainly of that era. I mean, there are supporting actors in it. But without giving too much away, they don't play a very big role. So really Bruce Dern sort of carries it. And I think you hit on it. I mean, this is an era, I think, too, in American history when people are starting to pay a bit more attention to ecological issues,
right,
which of course is the central theme of the film. So what was interesting to me about the movie is, it makes sense that this would come out at this point in history because, like I said, people are starting to pay more attention to the environment and what increasingly ramped up industrialization has done to our environment. But it plays pretty well today, and if anything, we've made them worse. And so it's a movie that addresses concerns that we still have. So.
All right, so yeah, I have some research on the movie. Had 3 screenwriters. Kind of surprised me that there's 3 people who wrote this, but was really interesting to see 2 names here that I was familiar with. Stephen Bochko and Michael Cimino were 2 of the screenwriters. Stephen Bochko is, of course, known for creating these like legendary TV shows of the 80s and 90s, like Hill Street Blues. Or I don't know if he created them, but I know he was like the developer. He was a big part, like a producer. Hill Street Blues and NYPD Blue. So later on, he'd be like a TV guy. And then Michael Cimino, a few years later, would win an Oscar for directing The Deer Hunter.
I noticed that as well when I was watching the credits, and that's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't have watching Stephen Bochco. I wouldn't have thought he would make this film, considering what I know of his career from TV and things. It seems a little bit outside of his realm, but you never know, right? I mean, filmmakers are filmmakers. They have broad interests like the rest of us. So that was that's an interesting thing about the movie for sure.
Yeah, a lot of these early 70s films where it has 2 or 3 screenwriters, usually it's names I don't recognize. So that was kind of interesting to see two of the 3. And then the film was directed by Douglas Trumbull. This was his directorial debut. He later directed a movie called Brainstorm, but he didn't make a lot of films as a director. He was more known for his visual effects work. He did the special effects for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Trek, the movie, and Blade Runner, all 3 of which he won an Academy Award for. Or no, I'm sorry, he was nominated for an Academy Award for all 3 of those movies. So he also did the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, I think that's worth noting too, because I'm sort of, I don't know that I'm famous for it, but I'm one of those film critics who does not like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which
I think we've talked about.
Yeah, which interestingly, that wasn't a film that was beloved when it came out. Like I feel like everybody's like, "Oh, you're an idiot" when you say you don't like 2001: A Space Odyssey now. And I'm like, as I recall, it got pretty widely like panned after Cannes. Like people walked out on it and stuff.
A lot of walkouts.
Yeah, so it's not like I'm the sole person who holds this opinion. But the thing about 2001: A Space Odyssey, while I bring it up, while not being a fan, the one thing I do love about that film is, regardless of what you think of the movie overall, I think it looks beautiful. And for the era, the effects and such were awfully good. I can watch that movie today, and while I have a hard time getting through it for other reasons, the visuals aren't one of them, and I think Trumbull had to play a role in that. Also, Blade Runner, one of my favorite sci-fi films of all time, incredible. Star Trek: The Motion Picture to me is a lot like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Big Star Trek fan, pretty much hated that movie. But
yeah, that one's kind of rough.
But I think the one thing that you can't complain about with that movie is the special effects and the visuals. Again, sort of like 2001, it's like it's a really good looking bad film. so
that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, I think he contributed some of the best parts to those movies to me. So that's worth noting.
So I feel like you don't see that very often, like a special effects person who even would go on to do more later, like has directed a few movies. You don't see that very often. So that's really cool. As I was talking about 2001, a really interesting piece of trivia about Silent Running is that Stanley Kubrick had wanted the Stargate sequence that takes place towards the end of 2001 to be about Saturn, but technical difficulties prevented completion of those special effects within the limited time available. So the Saturn idea was scrapped, and Kubrick substituted Jupiter instead. Trumbull developed the sequence after production, and it was recreated for Saturn in Silent Running.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why he directed Silent Running. He's like, I'm going to make this happen.
Yeah, well, it makes sense, right? He had probably spent a good degree of time thinking about what he was going to do, and then got disappointed when the rug got pulled out. So I'm gonna make it happen. I'm gonna have that Saturn sequence.
Yeah. So as I messaged you yesterday or the day before, I just found out that Douglas Trumbull, the director of Silent Running, passed away the week that we're recording this.
Yeah.
He passed away on February 7th, 2022.
Yeah, which is very sad. I looked a little into it after you alerted me to that fact too. And apparently he had been ill for some time and had a stroke and other things. And I think they're calling cancer the cause of death. And 79 years old, if I'm not mistaken. So certainly a very sad moment, but I guess not that surprising to those close to him, since he had a host of medical problems.
But it's happening on this podcast so frequently, Forrest. In December, I recorded an episode where I talked about how both Peter Bogdanovich and Betty White were still with us.
Right.
And then the episode aired 5 weeks later, and they had both died by the time the episode aired. It's very strange that it keeps happening on this podcast.
Well, yeah, so you've got to stop making podcasts because you're killing people, Brian.
I mean, oh my God, I'm just like, I listened back to a piece of and I was making a joke about how Betty White should be in this movie now at age 100, and I'm like, oh my God, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's the problem with creating media. I mean, realistically though, you're doing film at 50, right? And we gotta, and most of these filmmakers we're talking about weren't making these films when they're 15, right? So
I will find the one.
Yeah, I mean, so sadly, that's where we are, right? If you've got somebody who was 40 years old when they made the movie, we're talking about somebody who's 90 years old now.
It's why it's hard to book guests like to talk about the films 50 years on. I got Veruca Salt from Willy Wonka. That was like my big get for this podcast because she was 12 when she made the movie. So I have to just turn to the child actors. That's basically the best chance I have.
Absolutely. But yeah, definitely a sad Douglas Trumbull. And I think, for a lot of people,
extraordinary career.
Yeah, people who don't know the name because he largely did behind the scenes work. When you look at his credits for special effects, there's no question that the guy changed movies, right?
Changed cinema.
The visuals. Because, a lot of people point to Star Wars. I would say 1977 is the big moment when special effects really advanced. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think you can go back to this film and 2001: A Space Odyssey and say, a lot of things about those movies were ahead of their time. The special effects didn't seem cheesy in the way that a lot of sci-fi around the same era did. So, Trumbull was one of those people really pushing us toward where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, the special effects in Silent Running I found really astonishing. There's that shot towards the beginning where it starts on Bruce Dern, and then the camera pans out, and we keep seeing him moving in the frame as we see space around him. and that window, and then the whole spacecraft, and the camera pans back for what, 30-40 seconds. And I'm like, that is an amazing shot for 72.
Yeah, I think it. I mean, I think it holds up really well. Some films that rely on special effects, when you go back, like we're doing 50 years, I look at, even if they're really good films otherwise, and I'm like, oh man, that doesn't really. But there was nothing in Silent Running that made me that took me out of the film. It's like, oh man, that was so badly executed that that I'm reminded it's a 1970s film. It definitely had a 1970s vibe and look, which honestly, that's interesting to me, because popular culture that's created in a certain era reflects the era in one way or another. But it wasn't like, I no longer believe this is happening in space. And there are a lot of films from this era and slightly before where you watch them and you have that reaction, right? Or at least I do, where I'm like, yeah, okay, this was 1971. That's why I no longer believe this is actually happening in space. And I think that's really to Trumbull's credit. I mean, it's a good film.
Another film we talked about this month on the podcast, Tales from the Crypt, has a moment at the end where one of the characters falls into a pit of fire, and I fell off the sofa laughing so hard. It looked so bad. I'm like, some of the special effects in the movie looked kind of like, in that shot, that was like, wow, they got away with that in early 72. Like, that was acceptable. They said, picture lock, we're good.
Yep.
That was not the case here with Silent Running. A couple more things. Filmed in February and March of 1971 on a 32-day schedule. I don't know about you, Forrest. I'm like fascinated with just like when movies were made, like how long did it take? What was the budget? Like, do you play the game I do now of, was this film shot before or after the pandemic started?
Oh yeah, well,
I ask myself that every time I put on a 2021 movie, even 2022. Like, I think, was the shot before or after March 2020?
I do that sometimes. I'm especially curious about TV shows because I find there's a weird thing happening with a lot of them now, where you'll have scenes where like some characters are wearing masks but some aren't. And I'm just like, wow, what went into the decision to make, like, I was watching an episode of FBI the other day, and some of the police officers in the background are wearing masks, but none of the main characters are. And I'm like, so what went into that decision? What was the choice here? That our main characters are mask avoiders, but if you're in the background, everybody's masked up. It's just so that always interesting. I play that game too. I'm like, why did they decide to do that?
But I'm just fascinated by movies that they shoot it and it doesn't come out for a year and a half. Then other movies, they shoot it and 5 months later it's out.
Yeah.
Like, this movie was shot a year before it came out. And then Tales from the Crypt, which I just mentioned, was shot in the fall of 71. And then it came out in March of 72. So some movies have a very fast turnaround.
Right.
I think this movie, Silent Running, had to take a while to get all those special effects.
Right.
I mean, we have a lot of scenes of inside, like the interiors clearly built for the movie. And I don't think a lot of that they had to mess with in post-production, like all the robots, and a lot of this looks to have been done like for real on the movie. So I'm like, well, it's not like every shot they had to go back and add computers, effects and stuff like that, like they do now.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, they even shot part of it on an aircraft carrier or something to give it sort of the industrial look. And I think you're right that a lot of it was practical. Where they took a sort of militarized setting and built practical sets. So right.
So as you just said, the interiors were filmed aboard the decommissioned Korean War aircraft carrier USS Valley Forge, which was docked at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard in Long Beach, California. Shortly after filming wrapped, the carrier was scrapped. So this was done on it was like something that wasn't being used.
Right.
Which makes sense, like to save on money, right? As opposed to like building all of this on a stage or something.
That's the way to go if you can, because you may remember the film The Cooler. They filmed in Reno when
you're in that movie.
Yeah, when a casino was shut down, preparing to open, because what a great opportunity. We have this casino that's just about to open, fully realized, but nobody's in it, so we have run of the place for a week, and that makes sense.
Yes, that's how Speed got made. Speed was shot on a freeway that was like months away from opening. It was basically complete, but they weren't opening it yet for a couple more months. And so that's how they got all the footage on the freeway in LA. Because like, how do you shut down an LA freeway?
Yeah.
To make a movie, it's very difficult. So sometimes that it's just like luck of the draw. It's like the right timing. And yeah, so you got to be in the cooler. And getting to rub your shoulders up against William H. Macy and Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, exactly. I saw each of them briefly. Alec Baldwin slapped me on the back once, and that's my big claim to fame, right?
That was your claim to fame. Did you get to shake Maria Bello's hand?
I didn't. She was there when I was filming a seal.
I love her.
But she's great. I got to see most everybody on set. Like I said, Alec Baldwin was involved in the scene. I was an extra in, so he came by and slapped me on the back. Kind of scared me because I didn't expect it, but it was. And you see like the back of my head in that movie. So
I thought. My memory is that we see you like walking in slow motion in a shot, like we see you head to toe. Is that not true?
Well, I think you mostly see me, but not well. It's been a long time since I watched it. What I remember is you see basically the back of my head, like I'm in a scene that is important, but I'm not important.
We should have gotten one cut to your reaction. It would have made that movie. It would have gotten a Best Picture nomination.
Somebody did ask me in that film that we're going to walk off too far. Like if I had thought about, if I was interested in being Alec Baldwin's body double for like sequences when he was too busy to be on set or they didn't want to drag him out of his trailer, where I would basically be the stand-in for like lighting and stuff. I didn't have time to do that because I was doing a story as a journalist, but I always remember because I'm like, I think I'm a bit too fat to be Alec Baldwin's body double. And the guy says, "Have you seen Alec Baldwin lately?" And I'm like, ouch, throwing shade at the star.
I don't know who you would have been in Silent Running as an extra. There's not very many humans in the film. I mean, maybe one of the guys on the motor carts. Like you could have done that, right?
Yeah, I would have probably been Dewey though.
You would have been the stand-in for like for the lighting, like
you notice
they take the robot out and you sit there as Dewey.
Yeah, we haven't fully told everybody, right? So Huey, Dewey, and I guess we say Louie are
from DuckTales,
are
right?
drones in this ship, and you notice that the people that I don't know exactly what they did with them, but they're all credited at the end of the film.
Oh,
they are credited actors. So I did not look into exactly.
Are there people in there?
I am not entirely clear, but if you watch,
I did not
like if you even look at IMDb, it has Mark Persons as the gray drone #1.
Oh, okay.
Cheryl Sparks as the orange drone #2. And at the end of the film, they are very sort of prominently like introduced, like introducing so and so as the drones. So I guess through special effects, maybe there were people walking around in the drones, and now all of your listeners have to watch the film just to try to figure that out.
Exactly.
You'll notice when they walk, though, they which is an interesting choice. They don't walk really robotically.
Yeah, there is kind of like a human movement.
Yeah, they waddle sort of like maybe humans were in it, which makes me think, since they make a big note of who played them, that maybe indeed there are people in there, controlling them. So.
They have to be humans because they do a waddle like we do. So that made me laugh. Yeah, so that's interesting. Like I looked at 2 different places of like trivia. I read everything. I did not see anything about like humans being inside of. I thought they were like built from scratch and they were like they had wires and stuff that was moving them, but I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe you're right. Maybe they're. I mean, it's like R2D2.
Well, I mean, I didn't do enough research to know exactly what Trumbull or his crew did to. But there are definitely actors credited to those roles, and since we never see, we never see a face, I mean, they had to play some sort of role and making them work.
Yeah. Exactly. My last piece of trivia that I thought was kind of interesting, a novelization of the film was published by Scholastic Books in 1972. It was written by longtime children's book author Harlan Thompson, and features expanded scenes and flashback taking place on Earth. Do you think we needed more of that in the movie, like more scenes on Earth?
I don't know that it was necessary, since the characters do in dialogue reference what Earth has become.
Mm-hmm.
But I could see that being successfully incorporated. Yeah,
Okay.
I haven't read the novelization, but I could certainly see how that might fill in some gaps for
Mm-hmm.
people if the dialogue didn't do it. That said, I mean, I think what we get in the film, I had a pretty good understanding that Earth has been, ecologically destroyed, and that there are
Mm-hmm.
no forests anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, were our thoughts on this movie? What did you think, looking at it, either from a 50-year perspective or just like as a movie? Like, what was your take on Silent
Well,
Running?
I gotta say, I like it, and if people look into this film, they'll see a really interesting array of opinions. You may talk about this, but I mean, everything from people saying it's basically garbage to Roger Ebert, I believe, gave it 4 stars.
Four
So
stars.
people from going from saying it's a masterpiece to people saying it's not worth the film that it was shot on. I would go somewhere in the middle. I mean,
Yeah,
I
me
think
too.
it's a good film, and I enjoyed it, and I think the messaging is interesting. But I think
Mm-hmm.
some of the critics have points as well. There are some pretty key elements that I don't think are fleshed out as well
Mm-hmm.
would as would be nice to make it an even better movie. I like the idea of a guy who's spent 8 years of his life
Mm-hmm.
cultivating forests, and then getting told by a corporation, "Oh yeah, we're done with that now. Blow them up." I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
that speaks to the world on a lot of levels still today. And it's something I can certainly imagine happening. He's really invested himself in this, like, we could bring this back to the earth, and nobody but him really cares about it. And I sort of love that message, and I like the struggle that I see his character going through. That said, a little bit more development between the
Mm-hmm.
other human characters not played by Bruce Dern in the movie and him
Yeah.
would have been useful, I think.
Yeah, I was pretty so on this movie. As you said, I really like the ideas in it. I love movies where we're kind of just with one character in one place. Those are some of my favorite films. And I love Bruce Dern, but the movie was just kind of cold to me. Like, I didn't really ever get super involved, like, emotionally in the story. Like, I like the robots, I like the look of the film. There was a lot of things I liked in it, but it just never kind of grabbed me in a way I was hoping for. Maybe because I like a lot of my like science fiction, I like it a little bit more hard edged, and I found this one kind of like gooey and safe at times. Those Joan Baez songs are like took me out of the movie completely. I'm like, what's happened? It's like we're watching a 1972 commercial for something. I was like, what is this? So tonally, it had some issues, and I wanted to learn more about the other humans. They were very one dimensional, kind of tossed aside, and I don't know. I had some issues with
Yeah,
it.
I agree. And I mean, we see moments where I try to dance around this in case listeners haven't seen the film. I, there were some interesting things happening with Freeman, and
Mm-hmm.
his interactions with the other humans, that had they been more fleshed out, I think it would have been a better movie. But they show him struggling with how he has dealt with these people, but
Mm-hmm.
they never really bring any sort of conclusion to that struggle.
Yeah.
They don't really go much of anywhere with it. They just say, "Oh, he's struggling." And I'm totally with you with the Joan Baez songs. And if listeners aren't aware, I mean, they're interspersed throughout the movie, and that really
Yeah.
feels like, to me, like, hey, now we're going to start hitting you with a sledgehammer to tell you this movie is about saving the planet. In
Yeah.
case you didn't know, listen to this song
Yes, you were.
about saving the planet. And yeah,
Yeah.
and that was definitely problematic. So I can't buy into Roger Ebert's assessment that it's a masterpiece, but there was enough about it that I liked,
Oh
that
yeah, it's
I
worth watching.
enjoyed
Mm-hmm.
watching it. And I mean, here, I like it better than 2001: A Space Odyssey. So I've doomed myself, right? When people rank sci-fi films.
You would rank Silent Running over 2001? Come on.
I just don't like 2001. It puts me to sleep.
Really, that's so interesting. I find that movie hypnotic every second.
I love the visuals in that movie. I think it looks beautiful, but 45 minutes in, I start falling asleep. It's like I gotta, I gotta have a drum of Coke in the room that's being directly injected for me to stay awake through that film.
you need your wife with a drum set right next to you. Like every 5 minutes go like this.
That would make the film more interesting to me.
It's just to kind of jolt you.
You know what might work? Joan Baez songs. Had they inserted those every 15 minutes, it would be.
Yeah. I never felt there was enough like tension, enough crisis. It was just like there were a lot of scenes of Bruce Dern just kind of staring out the window, and like I'm like, give me a little bit of suspense. Like it just like there were stretches of this where, and I watched Edgar Wright did this video. It's on YouTube where he talks about his love for Silent Running when he saw it as a kid, and he kind of puts it as like the most important science fiction film in between 2001 and Star Wars. And he was talking about how much of like an effect it had on him when he was a kid. And I'm like, I feel like if you grew up with this movie and this was one of your first science fiction movies you saw when you were like between like ages like 5 and 15, like I'm like, I could see why this would be a very important film. And it's not to say that there was a science fiction movie coming out every other week in 1972.
Right.
And so it's unique in that regard. I think part of it is in 2022, I feel like I've seen this kind of story so many times and done better over the last 50 years that it was hard for me to kind of distance myself from that. I think if I had seen this younger in the 70s, maybe it would have had more of an impact.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, and let's be real. If I had to rate it, we're talking 2.5, 3 stars out of 4 territory. I'm like, I'm not on board with, man, it has so many flaws that it's a disaster, but I'm also not on board with it being any sort of masterpiece. I just, I think it's an enjoyable movie, and I like the fact, or maybe I shouldn't like the fact that the messages and the themes that are addressed in the film are still relevant today. I mean, I guess we should be saying, man, it would be great if they weren't still relevant today. But
glad we fixed that.
But they are. And and I think they're worthwhile themes to look at. I think it's also interesting from a historical standpoint to remind people. It seems like with people talking about climate change and all of this stuff going on, people feel like that's like a new debate. And it isn't, right? And this is a film from 1972 that says, hey, we were already thinking about this 50 years ago, and look where we've gone. And I sort of like the film from that standpoint too, as sort of a cultural, historical landmark, saying, hey, we've been talking about this stuff for a long time, and here we are.
Yeah. What did you think of Bruce Dern in this movie? Have you seen a lot of his films before, Bruce Dern?
Interestingly, I know one thing you want to talk about is Bruce Dern.
Yeah, he's kind of the show, so I thought we'd talk about him at the end.
I am not a huge Bruce Dern aficionado. I mean, he's done so much work. I'm certainly aware of
going back to like the 50s.
Yeah,
this guy has been around a while.
Started in TV and did a lot of TV, and then moved into
still
films,
with us.
Did a lot of films.
As of this recording, he's still with us.
Yeah, and hopefully that doesn't change. So I mean, a great actor, but interestingly, not an actor that I have religiously followed and just really latched onto his work. So I mean, I think he's good in the film, and that's something people have debated too. And things that I read about. There were some people that he didn't work for the roles. Others thought he was great. I think he's pretty good. I mean, I liked his performance. There were some things you talked about with him staring out into space. There were some editing choices that I didn't love, like. Now we're going to cut to Bruce Dern looking pensive. But I would not argue that's a Bruce Dern problem. I would argue those moments were more related to the editing of the film.
Yeah, it was weird because as it started, I was like, oh, this is really cool. Bruce Dern's kind of the main show here. And as it went on, I was starting to think, I don't know if he was necessarily the right choice for this to carry us through 90 minutes of mostly just him. Like I was thinking back on THX 1138 from last year, which was a science fiction film by George Lucas that had a really great lead performance by Robert Duvall. And I'm like, I feel like this movie would have been more gripping if like a Robert Duvall were in that role. Like if they're some of these actors where you just watching them think is just always fascinating. And as much as I love Bruce Dern and a lot of other roles, I just was like in the last half hour, he has some great moments, but I just wasn't sure if he had just quite what it took to carry the whole movie.
Interesting. I sort of like the understated, nuanced performance that he gave. I mean, that worked for me, but I can see what you're saying. I mean, Robert Duvall, I mean, I wouldn't argue that point. I mean, Robert Duvall would be great in anything, right? So I would expect you could swap the two guys out and still have an equally good film, because I'd be the last one to say, well, Robert Duvall would ruin that because, you know, but imagine maybe like a Charlton Heston.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think Bruce Dern is better than Charlton Heston.
Yeah, I think you could easily like turn to a Charlton Heston in this era, and it would become vastly more soapy and melodramatic and things like that. Not to you know, overly critique Charlton Heston, because he's done some things.
I like him in a lot of
stuff. Yeah, he's done a lot of, but I think had he taken that role, the chance of it becoming too melodramatic would go up. So I like sort of the nuanced performances. But to your point about the film maybe not being as dynamic as it could be, I mean, he definitely has an understated performance, right? Yeah.
It's a quieter performance from him. And he is kind of known for, not in everything, of course, not for what he got, you know, Oscar nominations for, but sometimes he's kind of known for being a little bit bigger and crazier of a performer. Who is it? Just Jim Carrey does an amazing Bruce Dern impression at the Meryl Streep AFI. It's one of my favorite impressions of an actor. And so there is like this, there is this kind of vision we have of him, and that's not the case in Silent Running. He's very subtle. My favorite moment from him is at the end, where he tells that story about writing his name and address on that letter and putting it in the bottle and throwing it in the ocean or the wherever, and he talks about how he always wondered where it ended up, like who found that letter. And it's just it's like very like this emotional story he tells. That for me was maybe my favorite moment of the whole movie. Like that's where it was just on him telling the story that meant something to him from childhood to now. And I thought that worked really well. Like there were moments throughout that I really enjoyed. And that was one of them.
And that little monologue, I mean, ties in, it turns out to be thematically important too. So I think that's one of the things I like about the film and the structure. So yeah, I have no complaints about Bruce Dern here. I mean, and I think, you know, since we're talking about him, one of the things you wanted me to think about before the podcast was favorite Bruce Dern movies. I mean, I think this is one of mine and I again say this not being somebody who has exhaustively watched his body of work. He's just an actor that
you haven't seen everything.
I haven't, but you know, I've been aware of him, of course, over the years. But I think this is one of my favorite performances, in part because of what you talk about. If you think of what's a generic Bruce Dern performance like, you're probably going to imagine something wilder and crazier,
very big,
and he's really restrained in this movie, and I dug that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, he's an actor who's always interesting in whatever he pops up in, but I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen him on screen alone this long. And I don't know if it's like the script letting him down a little bit throughout. I just was like, I wanted more. I wanted to really be on his side and be rooting for this guy all the way to the end, like I do in so many other films that are one-man shows, like Castaway, like you mentioned before. And I like, there was a disconnect, and I couldn't quite place it. I'm like, is this Dern? Is this the script? Is this because it's early 70s? Is it because it's rated G? Rated G, Forrest.
It may be all of those things, Brian, because I mean, one thing that I think is interesting about the movie, but again, I would argue this is an interesting point, is I'm not sure, you know, it's too bad we can't ask Douglas Trumbull about this, but I'm not sure how the audience is supposed to feel about Freeman Lowell, about Bruce Dern's character. Like, in one sense, you get the feeling we're supposed to admire him, but in another sense, we get the feeling that we're not supposed to admire him. And that's like, and there's some conflict within the character himself, which is my biggest complaint. I wish that conflict, the inner conflict would have been more expanded on. But that might be part of it too. I mean, it's sort of hard to just completely root for the character because I'm not even sure the character is entirely rooting for himself.
That's a good point. Yeah.
He's sort of torn apart, and that does make it tougher for an audience if you're like, well, I want to root for him, but there's all this stuff out there making me think maybe I shouldn't.
Yeah. So I also wrote down in my notes, I'm like, would I like this movie better if it was a little cheesier? Like it takes itself very seriously, right?
Yeah.
I mean, especially with the songs. And I'm like, I wonder if it had a little bit of tongue in cheek. Didn't have to be like a comedy, but like maybe just a little bit, took itself a little bit less seriously. I wonder if I would have enjoyed it more on that level. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I could see that. A little more Soylent Greenish.
Which we will get to in 2023. That's a 73 release, which someone pointed out, like the poster predicts like in 2022.
Yeah.
And it's like, and they got like 5 things right. Like it's like getting things right about our year, which I'm really excited to talk about in a a about that movie. I've never seen Soylent Green.
Oh, really? Well,
yeah. I want Charlton Heston. Right?
Yeah, I won't say much about it, but it's a sci-fi classic. So yeah, I think you'll at least enjoy thinking about it and delving into it.
So yeah, that's about all I have in my notes. Anything else you wanted to say about Dern or any other scenes we didn't touch on that you wanted to mention?
No, I mean, I think you hit on most of them. I did like the scenes with the drones. I will say that the robots
the robots are great.
That were in one way or another, enacted by people, because they make some interesting choices there. Anytime you deal with AI, you have to decide, well, are they sentient or are they not? And these are AI that don't really talk, and they're clearly programmed, but they also clearly are supposed to have emotions. They make choices that are illogical, as Spock would tell us. And I really like some of Dern's or Freeman Lowell's interactions with the drones and their interactions with each other, because they made interesting choices to make them humanistic AI, and I just thought it was fascinating the way they were handled. Like you could probably have an entire podcast talking about these drones and how sentient they are and things along that line. So I liked most of the scenes involving them.
Like 500 episodes just about that in Silent Running.
Well, there's one we can probably say there's one scene that I liked where one of the drones had become injured and lost a foot, and the other drones are like looking over the scene of this injury, and clearly robots that are AI that are just programmed to do jobs would you would think ignore that because it's not part of their mission, but they're like sort of surveying the scene, and I'm like, it was just a really thoughtful, interesting scene, because I'm like, okay, well, these are robots, but they're robots that realize what has happened, and they don't have a job to do. They're reflecting on what has happened. I'm like, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I like the look of the film, the work on the robots and all of that, really ahead of its time. So I think if you're a science fiction fan, it's worth checking out. I had my issues with it, but I think a lot of people would really enjoy this movie. So don't keep yourself from checking it out if you're interested in this genre, this period of the genre in the early 70s. It's really, I like this period of science fiction, like early 70s. Like it's like all the ones I've looked at, even the ones I don't like as much as some others. Like there's always something of interest that I take away. So that was really cool. So the last question about the movie: if they were to make Silent Running now, Forrest, what would the movie look like in 2022 if they remade this story made it today?
Well, I think it would please you. I think they'd go darker, right? I think they'd get rid of the G rating. I think we're looking at
it wouldn't be rated G.
I think we're looking at least PG-13, and maybe if you got it in the hands of the right director, an R.
Make it a hard R.
Yeah, it would be darker. It would be more Blade Runner-esque, right? Because we
get a woman on board.
We've had Blade Runner. Well, you might have some stuff like that, which would arguably not make it better, but I mean, I think you'd go darker. You'd lose a lot of the stuff that bothered you and me. Frankly, the songs aren't going to, the Joan Baez songs aren't going to be cranked up. And, I think it's just, I think it's mainly going to be a lot darker.
Yeah, I would love to see what would Alex Garland do with this, the guy who made Ex Machina and Annihilation.
Right.
Like, what would he do with this property? That would be interesting. Whether it was a limited series or a film, like that would be.
And really I think they'd probably address my concern too. There'd be a lot more of the internal conflict. I hope they would resolve the internal conflict of the main character a little bit more. So that would be my guess if they remade it, where they would go. Which frankly, considering that these issues are still with us, we see so many remakes. This would not be a terrible project to remake.
Yeah, like I feel like the title Silent Running is kind of well known, right?
Yeah.
Like when I was looking through the 72 releases, that title immediately jumped out at me as one that I had heard of. Like it wasn't just completely, even though I'd never seen it, I wasn't confused as to what it was. So I feel like if there's notoriety even a little bit for the title, like I think that helps get a project going. I would not be surprised if this got remade in the next 5 years.
Yeah, it will. And the reason, I mean, it's a remake you could actually make better too. Like we haven't really talked about it. I'm a big fan of Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, but great movie. But on the other hand, I'm also like, well, was it really necessary? Because the original West Side Story was, it's like great.
It's like almost perfect.
Great director with great source material makes another great version of a film that was already great.
Shocker.
Silent Running, as we've talked about, I enjoyed it, and there are things that you can certainly recommend about it and admire about it, but I do think there are enough flaws that if you address those flaws, you could have a Silent Running that is a better version, which to me are the remakes that I really enjoy, right? Where they either rethink a lot of things or actually, make improvements where the first round, failed.
Yeah, there was enough good things in Silent Running that I could see a really talented director taking those ideas and just pushing them into the new century and making it really cool. Like sometimes we're like, don't remake everything. Right. I feel like this one could maybe benefit from a modern day remake. I think it could be great. Get like an Oscar Isaac, some really great actor in that lead role today.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Like that, I think people would be on board. I think people would want to watch.
Good casting choice there. You should pitch that, Brian.
I worked in casting for 2 years for us. I know my casting.
You direct Oscar Isaac. I think you've got a Netflix hit there.
Oh, if I were to direct Oscar Isaac in a movie, it wouldn't be Silent Running. It'd be like a gay love story.
Okay. Make them both.
It could be in Silent Running.
Tarantino worked with Bruce Dern a lot. There's no reason you can't make the gay love story and Silent Running remake.
They should do Silent Running today and have it just be Bruce Dern again.
Well, yeah. that would be interesting.
What is he, like late 80s?
Yeah.
90, somewhere around there?
Yeah.
Why not? Go for it. It's like a shot-for-shot remake with the same actor. I've suggested that on the podcast before. Like, that's a movie they haven't done yet, where they, like 30, 40 years on, they remake it like Psycho, but shot for shot, but with the same people playing the same role.
That's true. That would be interesting.
That would be. It's never been done before.
That's true. I mean,
I would watch it.
I would watch it too. It'd get a lot of attention just the fact that it was made.
But it would have to be like a teen movie, where it's like they're still teens, but now they're in their 50s. Like it's American Pie in like 2037, and it's the same actors, but they're still playing 17. They're just adults.
Pretty in Pink. There's a lot.
Somebody someday, come on, make it happen. All right, so that takes us to our final two segments. The first one is the Divine Double Feature. What would be your recommendation someone should put on that's more modern? I mean, this is only 85 minutes. Silent Running is pretty short. Like, what would you recommend something thematically similar, same genre? Like, what's something newer you would recommend someone put on right after?
I thought a lot about this, and I had a few good answers. Like I could imagine a number of double features that I think would work well.
Mm-hmm.
But since it's a G-rated movie, I think Under the Gun, since you're telling me, tell our audience right now, I am going to say Wall-E.
Oh, that's a great choice.
Animated film.
Just watched that with my students yesterday, Forrest. And man, I hadn't seen it in a long time. I have this enrichment class where it's like 35 minutes a few days a week. And sometimes we read, sometimes we watch a film. And this week I don't know why, I was feeling Wall-E. I'm like, I don't think I've seen that movie in 15 years. Or I mean, almost 15. When it came out, I think I saw the opening week in 2008. So 14 years ago. I don't think I've seen it since it came out.
I mean,
such a beautiful film. Amazing.
Beautiful. And I will say a better movie, right? I mean, Wall-E is a 4-star film, but Wall-E reminded me a little bit of the drones in Silent Running, and the environmental message, of course, is there 100%. And so, yeah, I just think that would make a great double feature.
A great film history lesson for the kiddos in your family. Start with Silent Running. And then move along to Wall-E. I think the kids will like Wall-E more.
Yeah, well, I mean, as mentioned, better film, no question. Even though I'm the one who likes Silent Running better out of the two of us, Wall-E is a vastly superior movie overall.
And it was weird because I remembered when I saw it, I remember a lot of it. I loved it. I remember a lot of it being slow. And I was like, the last 30 minutes of Wall-E moves along, like it has got action sequences, explosions. I'm like, man, I forgot about this. Like it's not as quiet of a film that I remembered. Like it starts that way, but then it's very entertaining and really exciting and beautiful love story.
I love that film, and I think it would make a nice double feature.
Yeah, so that's a great choice. I went with The Martian. Like I was thinking like a modern day science fiction movie that has like a person secluded somewhere where they're kind of like a botanist too. Like they're like getting the plant life is like a big part, creating that plant life in The Martian, Matt Damon. It's a film I only saw once. I remember really loving it. I really enjoyed it. I need to see it again. But I thought that would be kind of a cool movie to piece with Silent Running, to look at the genre over many, many decades and just kind of see where we've come. And it's a great Matt Damon performance. He got an Oscar nomination. The movie was nominated for Best Picture. I would go with The Martian. I think that'd be a cool choice too.
Yeah, that's an incredible choice. And actually, that didn't make my short list, which it
really. What were, just real quick, what were the other
ones?
Well,
I thought about Avatar. I really latched on to the ecological messages. So I thought about Avatar. I thought about Interstellar. And I even entertained like Avengers Endgame for a while because interestingly, big MCU fireworks, not what you would, think compared to Silent Running. But when you look at sort of the messaging and what they're fighting for, it's related. And so I latched on that environmental theme, and those were the ones that made my short list.
Yeah, those are fantastic. So yeah, all good choices. I really like your idea of Wall-E. I didn't even go there. I should have thought about it. I was watching it yesterday. I should have thought of that. It's a great choice. All right, our last segment, Beyond the Flick. Let's talk a little bit about Bruce Dern. So outside of Silent Running, any other films that come to mind that you really love him in?
Well, I got to say, somebody who has really followed his career more closely than me will probably have better answers. But the ones that really started, I really like his work with Quentin Tarantino.
Yes.
I think he's great.
The 3 films?
George Spahn, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, he plays. He's the General Sandy Smithers in Hateful Eight, which is, again, a memorable performance.
Great role.
Probably the role that I remember him best in, where he's more of the primary focus, is Alexander Payne's 2013 film, Nebraska. I mean,
yes, Academy Award nomination.
Yeah, fantastic in that. So I think those would be my choices. His body of work with Tarantino. I believe he's also in Django Unchained, and then Nebraska. I mean, just a really stellar performance in Nebraska.
Yeah. Nebraska is my number one choice. Sorry, my dogs are going. So yeah, Nebraska would be my number one choice. That that is what Alexander Payne does so well. He takes some of these actors that we haven't really seen in like a big role in a while, or like a really important role. Like looking at Bruce Dern's filmography, he's been actively working in films from like the 60s to now, but there are gaps.
Right.
Like if you look at his filmography, you'll see like 10 titles that I've never even heard of. I'm like, what are these movies? Like a lot of small films.
Right.
Nebraska really put him back on the map alongside his work with Tarantino. So he's had some really great roles this last decade. Did you know Burt Reynolds was going to play that role in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and then he passed away?
Oh yeah,
and that's why they got.
I had read that briefly, but yeah, I
was in like Bruce
now.
Yeah, so Burt Reynolds was like, I think he was at the table read like before they were like he was going to do that role. But Bruce Dern did a great job with that. I think about his role in The Hateful Eight a lot. Like I loved him in that. That was like a great ensemble cast. Right. So many fantastic people. But he like made a mark in that movie. I remember his role. Yeah. Like he's like the oldest one in the room, and he has his thoughts about things. And I'm like, wow, this is a great role for him too. I also like his work with Alfred Hitchcock. He was in Marnie from 1964.
Right. Good, great.
He plays Tippi Hedren's dad in Flashback, and it's just like a very brief performance, but it's very memorable at the end. He's great in that. He was also in Hitchcock's final movie, Family Plot, which is not great, but it's like a mid-70s lead performance from him, and it's the last Hitchcock film, so I think that's important to mention. He's also great in Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, Will Penny, Hang 'em High, They Shoot Horses, Don't They, The Burbs, and of course the Tarantino movies. But yeah, my favorites would be The Hateful Eight. I think he's great in that. Nebraska. And then the other film he got an Oscar nomination for. Have you seen Coming Home from 1978 with Jane Fonda and Jon Voight?
I haven't. Yeah, I mean, I got to say, I was honestly a bit embarrassed how little of his work he's seen. I mean, he's been, like you say, he's been working for so long. I mean, in
6+ decades.
In great television series before really moving on to film. And, you know, like I said, he's one of those guys I've been very much aware of, and you know, certain performances really stood out to me, but I've you know, missed a lot of the ones that you mentioned, and it's kind of embarrassing because I'm like, man, that's some big gaps in my in my viewing. But he is a great actor, so
yeah. Like an older film he's in that I'd highly recommend you check out is Coming Home. It wasn't the Best Picture winner that year. That went to The Deer Hunter. But it was like the Oscar year of Vietnam, right? And for 78, Deer Hunter wins director and picture. Actor and actress are both for Coming Home, and Bruce Dern got an Oscar nomination for supporting actor for Coming Home. And he has some really riveting, raw scenes with Jane Fonda, and that he's a soldier. He's back from Vietnam, and he is not acclimating well to his new environment, and he has, remember there's a scene towards the end, like it's just like really powerful, and it's a fantastic performance. So definitely check out Coming Home. He's also in 3 other movies that came out in 72. He's in a film called The Cowboys, Thumb Tripping. Got to check out Thumb Tripping for us. And a movie I have seen, which is actually really good, called The King of Marvin Gardens with Jack Nicholson. It's actually really interesting, kind of like, it's one of the few 70s movies starring Jack Nicholson that's kind of gone under the radar, but it was in this Criterion box set I watched about 3 years ago. And it's not perfect, but it was like a really interesting kind of curious, like kind of a curio of Bruce Dern and Jack Nicholson together for an hour and a half. Same director as 5 Easy Pieces. And it's just like a really great film. So I'd recommend The King of Marvin Gardens as well. But yeah, like with you, there's a lot of Bruce Dern movies I need to check out. So many titles I've never even heard of. So
well, yeah,
I'm sure there's some great performances in there I don't even know about.
Yeah. I mean, I'm right there with you though. I mean, if I had to rank them, I would say Nebraska is my number 1, and then probably Hateful Eight number 2, and I would actually throw Silent Running in there. But again, noting that I've got a lot of gaps in my knowledge with Bruce Dern. So, you know, I mean, you could do a podcast about Bruce Dern movies, right? When you
Bruce Dern podcast.
I was looking at the guy's filmography before this, and
this would take a while.
I mean, I know I've seen him in a lot of TV too, because he's one of those actors, like I say, that it's never been somebody I've really delved into his body of work. Like I'm going to really see everything, but I'm like, I know I've seen him in some of these TV shows. You know, I'm looking back and it's like, I know why I know him despite not having, sought out all of his films, because I bet I've seen him in, 15 TV shows, and over the years he pops up as supporting characters. Sometimes I mean, he's just a really, fantastic actor who's been at it a long time.
Well, I do that every year, Forrest. Every January, I pick an actor and I pick a director, and I watch over the course of 12 months, I watch everything they did from beginning to end. Like this year, I'm doing Cary Grant as my actor. I've watched his first 7 films, which are a little shaky, but it's going to get better.
Right.
And then Vincent Minnelli, the great musical director of Meet Me in St. Louis and Gigi and all these great musicals, 80% of his films I'd never seen. So I'm taking a look at his work. So maybe down the road, I'll pick Bruce Dern and maybe not see everything, but like get like a good sense of his career a little bit more than I have now, because there are a lot of gaps for sure.
I was gonna say you're gonna need to give yourself 2 years if you watch everything, because that's a lot of work to delve into.
Well, I cheat a little bit. Last year I did Betty Davis, and she has 120 film credits. Like I wasn't gonna watch 120 of her movies, so I kind of like I would look at, there'd be a year where she had 8 titles, and I would pick like, what are the 2 of these 8 that's like the most famous or the highest rated on IMDb, on whatever, and the other 6 I would just like pull up on YouTube and look at a clip. But I'd pick like 2 a year that I'd actually sit and watch the whole thing. But as Leonardo DiCaprio said when he won his Golden Globe Award for The Wolf of Wall Street in 2014, when he was in the category with Bruce Dern, who was nominated for Nebraska, he said, for any young aspiring actor, take a look at Bruce Dern's work, because it'll help you out in the long run. So, which I thought was really fantastic. So yeah, Bruce Dern, we love you. This was really fun to talk with you today, Forrest, about Silent Running and the career of Bruce Dern. Do you have anything you'd like to promote or tell our listeners where they can find you online?
Oh, I'll just say I am the chief film critic for Highbrow Magazine. That's where I publish most of my stuff these days. I still got a website out there, forresthartman.com, but I'm a full-time teacher like you, so I got to say I don't update that all that often. Usually when I produce new work, which is relatively frequently, I send it out to Highbrow Magazine, which is a great online publication. So I would just say encourage people to go there. You'll find not only my work, but work from a lot of other great writers as well. And they're an online publication that really supports the arts and does a lot of arts criticism and arts writing, which I value a lot. So that's where I'll send people.
Very cool. Well, it's always fun to have you here, Forrest. So thanks for being here. Thanks to all of you for listening. You can find us online at filmat50.com or on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And check out my new YouTube channel, Brian Rowe Video. Every week I'm updating with videos on Oscar history and films and actors that I love. So check that out, Brian Rowe Video. Until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.